My presentation looks at the book we've just published on our second visit to our 7 estates that we've now been studying for about 15 years, I think I worked out. It's kind of frightening. And just to start, I wanted to fill you in on the neighbourhoods we're looking at. So the research looks at 10 years of developments on these 7 estates, and the 7 estates we didn't choose on any particularly strong basis to be representative of social housing around the country, but we did try to pick estates and neighbourhoods from all parts of the country that were built at different periods and were reasonably representative of the way social housing is distributed. So the 7 estates we studied are, first of all, Cranmore in Sligo, which is an estate in the centre of Sligo town that was built between the 1970s and the 1980s. You'll see the picture there of Cranmore is of a part of Cranmore that's recently been taken over by Clúid Housing Association and very nicely refurbished. The rest of the estate is Sligo Borough Council, now Sligo County Council accommodation. The next estate we studied is Minorities in Limerick. Minorities was built between the early 1970s and the mid-1980s. It's a very large estate of over 1,000 houses, which is on the edge of Limerick City. And you can see it's generally houses, semi-detached and terraced houses. And then the third estate we looked at is in Cork. So you can see it down at the bottom there beside the UCD logo. And it's called Dean Rock. And it's located in Toker, which is in the south kind of inner suburbs of Cork. And Dean Rock is an interesting one because it was built in the late 1960s by the National Building Agency, which also was responsible for building Ballymun and St Michael's Estate, which is quite close to here. And it's the only one of the estates we looked at that was what they call system built, so it was built partially refurbished or prefabricated estate. And the locals told us stories about the estate arriving in on the back of lorries one day and being put up quite quickly. The estate was extensively refurbished in the 80s. It originally consisted of houses and flats. There's just houses there now, and the picture there is of some of the houses after refurbishment. Then we looked at an estate in Dundalk called Mahevnamore, which is also quite a large housing estate, and it was built also between the early 1970s and the early 1980s over quite an extended period. And we looked at South Finglas in Dublin, which is also a very large housing estate built in the 1970s. An interesting thing about South Finglas is some of it was built by Dublin City Council to let out, but some of it was built for immediate sale to tenants. So from its very early stages, it was quite a mixed neighbourhood. Then the next estate we looked at is the one we're in today, which is Fatima Mansions in Rialto. So you can see the picture of Fatima Mansions. It looks quite different from the estate we see today. So the estate has been subject to a number of regeneration schemes over the years, but most recently in 2004 the estate was demolished and rebuilt as part of a public-private partnership scheme. Now, Fatima was originally built in the 1940s and consisted of flats, the traditional design of inner city flats in Dublin. Now it's a mixed estate consisting of some private housing, some local authority housing, and some housing that's been sold to former tenants. And it also includes community facilities and sports facilities and private businesses, etc. So it's seen the most dramatic change of any of the estates we looked at. And then finally the estate I have the aerial shot of there at the bottom. The final estate we looked at is Fettercairn, which is in Tala, on the outer suburbs of Dublin. And Fettercairn was also built between the 1970s and 1980s, and it's a very large estate of houses, of terraced houses and semi-detached houses. So these are the estates we studied, and this is the estates which is the focus of the book. So what kind of research did we carry out on the estates? We studied the estates at 2 phases. Between 1997 and 1998, that was the first phase. And then we went back for a second visit between 2007 and 2009. And a group of colleagues conducted the research. It's been ongoing for so long. Some of the group have actually retired. But anyway, among the rest of us who are still going, we're from UCD, UCC in Cork, the National University of Ireland in Maynooth, the University of Limerick, and also Mary Immaculate College, Limerick. And the research involved a very large amount of in-depth interviews with residents, about 350 interviews in all, and also with service providers on the estate, guards, teachers, people working for the local authority, etc. And in the second phase of the research in particular, we devoted a lot of time to analysing survey data about the estate and also data on public expenditure on the estates. So that's something my colleagues from the University of Limerick and Mary Immaculate College will talk about in the next presentation this morning. And to date, the research has yielded 2 books. We published a book on the research in 1999 called Social Housing in Ireland, which was edited by my colleague, Professor Tony Fahy from UCD. And you can see our most recent book, which we published earlier this year, which has been launched today. I also want to acknowledge that because the research involved quite a good deal of field work, funding for the project was particularly important. And the whole study was actually initiated by the Catherine Howard Foundation, which are a small but really, really valuable charitable foundation that funds social projects in disadvantaged neighbourhoods and also research in disadvantaged neighbourhoods. And they actually came up with the idea of doing the research in the first place. We've also received funding from Pobble, and also from the Departments of Social Protection and Departments of the Environment, and from the Combat Poverty Agency, now sadly no longer with us, but much missed. So I want to move on now and give you an idea of the issues we looked at in the research and what we found out, what were our broad findings. So even though both studies were and visits to the estate were done separately, the issues we were looking at were very similar over both. And our interest can kind of be summed up by the subtitle of the original book we published in 1999, which is Success or Failure in Social Housing. And we also had a working title for the second book, which was Liveable or Leavable, which we didn't use. So those phrases sum up what we were interested in and finding out about in the estates. We were particularly interested in finding out why do the vast majority of social housing estates provide really attractive environments for people to live, good livable neighbourhoods. They're in very high demand among people on the waiting list to get in, but then a minority of social housing estates provide such unattractive environments that they need to be subject to very extensive regeneration, or in lots of cases in Ireland, to demolition and rebuilding. So why is that? Why does that happen? We were interested in looking at the extent to which the social and economic characteristics of residents influence livability. So people who are social housing tenants, whether they're tenants of local authorities, whether they're tenants of housing associations, have very high rates of disadvantage. We know that. They tend to have low incomes. There are much higher rates of, for instance, lone parents and other groups at risk of poverty in the social sector than outside. Does that explain the problems in some estates and lack of problems in the other? We were also interested in looking at the role of neighbourhood level factors. Is it neighbourhood factors like how cohesive the community is, how successful the community is, or the quality of dwellings? Are they the important factor in determining how livable these estates are? And we were also interested in looking at how social housing managers, community development organisations and policy makers can promote livable social housing estates. So how can we ensure estates settle and become vibrant and successful communities? So this is what we found to summarise our findings. We found, as Aidan has mentioned, that the vast majority of social housing neighbourhoods are successful, well-settled communities. I've calculated since local authorities and housing associations first got involved in building social housing in the 1880s, they've provided around 400,000 dwellings in Ireland, which is about 22% of the housing stock. I may have lost some dwellings that have been built over that long period, but it's about 22% of the housing stock. Only about 9% of those, or 9% of the housing stock remains in the social housing sector. So the rest has been sold to tenants, and it generally has blended seamlessly with surrounding neighbourhoods. In fact, lots of people would be surprised if people said to them this estate or this county council cottage or whatever was originally social housing. So the vast majority of social housing built has provided very important, very good quality accommodation for people, livable neighbourhoods, and also social housing is a very important anti-poverty measure. Tenants pay a rent which is related to income. If your income goes down, your rent falls. If your income rises, your rent rises. So social housing plays a very important and generally under-acknowledged role as an important anti-poverty measure in Ireland. We also found that estates were successful despite the high level of disadvantage. The level of disadvantage in social housing, among social housing tenants, is uniformly high. Practically everybody is on a low income, and that's got worse in recent years as there's fewer houses being built and people are having to queue up on the waiting list to get in, and generally lettings are to more disadvantaged people. And there's also, I think it's fair to say, a widespread assumption, particularly in media reporting on social housing, that all these neighbourhoods are problematic. That's not true. Now, we did find that livability, that not all neighbourhoods provide very livable environments. Some don't, some are problematic, and also livability can change over time. So among the 7 estates we looked at, Fatima Mansions, where we're today, and Fettercairn and Tala were the ones that experienced most marked improvement in livability. And we were very interested in this because, as you can see, Fatima has been demolished and rebuilt and been the subject of a pile of public expenditure and expenditure from the private sector via PPP. So there's been a lot of spending on building. But in Fettercairn, there's been much more modest investment in improving the built environment. Well, there have been some useful interventions, but Fettercairn has also settled well and improved well, so that was interesting. One other point we found, which was very important, we don't dwell on it in a lot today, but it's important to point out, there's very significant internal diversity within the estates we studied. So it is hard to generalise in some ways about whether neighbourhoods are successful or not, because often parts of neighbourhoods are in very, very high demand, and they can exist side by side in a very small geographical area with sub-neighbourhoods that are in less demand and are quite stigmatised. And we found that the residents in the neighbourhoods were very strongly aware of which was the better part of the estate and which was the not so desirable part. Outsiders less so, but among residents it was very important. So just to pick a topical example of this, this is the arch in the old Fatima Mansions estate, so Fatima prior to it being demolished. And one of the things we were struck by when we did the first phase of the research in the late 1990s was the extent to which Fatima was divided by the arch. So people talked about under the arch. There was a much more desirable part of Fatima, or a less desirable, depending on which side of the arch. And on one side of the arch there was an area which everybody called the yuppie blocks. So for the local people, they thought the estate was very, very differentiated internally, and it was. But for people from the outside, the level of differentiation in the community wasn't really appreciated. So then just to move on to what we found about what drives improved livability. And this section of the research was written up by my colleague, Professor Mary Corcoran from NUI Maynooth. So some of the areas she highlighted as being very important for improved livability are, firstly, raised aspirations of residents. So she found that over the 10-year period we've been visiting the estates, the aspirations of residents for the types of jobs they should get, the types of education, and particularly their aspirations for their children had improved very markedly. And here are just some illustrations, some quotes from the research just to illustrate this point. A teacher in Dean Rock told us, I can see here that parents are starting to believe their child might go to secondary school that they might have never to aspire to in the past. They might get to college. I'm not necessarily saying that every child should go to college, but that parents were now aspiring that their child could go there, and there should be nothing to stop them. And also, lots of the service providers we spoke to talked about the power of parents going back and doing continuing education and doing courses and doing their Leaving Cert when they were older in improving their aspirations for their family and their life and also for their children. So that was very important. Another very strong theme in the research, a key driver of improving livability, was the strength of the community structures in two ways. The first was community engagement, so people working within their own community to provide services, to work with neighbours, to try and improve the built environment was a very important driver of improved livability. And often that was done through sport and through cultural activities. And people felt it was very important for keeping young people out of trouble. Particularly sport was very, very important for engaging young men, teenage boys after school and during the summer holidays. So those types of generally voluntary activities provided by the community themselves were very, very important. We also found one of the big differences in the neighbourhoods where livability had improved a lot was that the public space was reclaimed for community use. So this was an issue in Fatima prior to the refurbishment, that people didn't feel safe in the public space. But communities engaged in measures to reclaim the public space. So things like community bonfires were very common. Rather than having bonfires everywhere for Halloween, they'd organise one as a community. Festivals, community murals, gardening and clean-ups, etc., were really important in improving the pride of people in their own communities. Oops, sorry. The next driver of improved livability was community capacity, and that refers to residents campaigning on behalf of their communities. So campaigning for regeneration, campaigning for better public services, campaigning for refurbishment, and also residents running community development activities and often providing lots of services, important services for their community through that community development mechanism. And just to highlight some local examples to us here, Fatima Groups United, which are the umbrella representative group for community organisations in Fatima Mansions, played a particularly important role in firstly campaigning for the regeneration of the estate, but also then in trying to shape the plans for the regeneration to reflect what they felt was appropriate for their needs, and researching what would work best in turning the estate around. So just at the bottom of the slide there, I have some examples of some publications by Fatima Groups United around the regeneration and around their campaigning, and also advice for other community groups engaged in regeneration, which you can download from their website if you're interested in looking at. So then, in neighbourhoods where livability didn't improve, where it declined, and that did happen in some of the estates we looked at, what were the drivers of this? What caused this? One of the issues was social segregation. So in areas where you had very large concentrations of social housing, or where some parts of estates were very stigmatised, this disimproved livability. We also found stigma. The stigma of the neighbourhood was a very particular issue. And colleagues of mine from the University of Limerick who participated in the study did a very interesting paper, which is in the book, on media reporting of the Ross estate in Limerick, for instance, which underlines the role which the media can play in undermining the reputation of a neighbourhood. And we found that reputation is very difficult to change, and also when there are regeneration programmes, they rarely have a strategy included to try change the reputation. And then you'll see, just to give a topical example of media reporting and negative reputation of social housing. The article I have copied into the side of the slide there is taken from the Sunday Independent in 1999 when we launched the original book, and there was their reporting on the findings of the original book, Housing Estates Hell Shock Report. So apart from undermining the reputation of the neighbourhoods, portraying the research unfairly, we were very upset by this at the time because we felt it undermined the trust the communities we studied had placed in us. So I suppose we learned a sharp lesson in how difficult it is to guide and to change media perceptions of social housing. Then in terms of drivers of declining livability, we identified one other important factor, and that is marginalised or disaffected minorities within the estates. We found that in neighbourhoods where livability was declining, it was often the result of activities by a small minority group within the area who were disaffected from the mainstream. So people who were engaged in serious antisocial behaviour, often related to drugs markets. And my colleague Aileen O'Gorman did the research in the book on drugs and drugs markets and highlighted some issues related to their impact on the estates in a lot of depth. We also found there were issues in lots of the estates in relation to what social workers call multiproblem households. So households who may have drug problems, alcohol problems, issues with their children, be very distant from the labour market, maybe be in a situation where there's multi-generational unemployment. And we found that these households were generally engaged, the households that were committing the behaviour that was undermining the stability of the estate, discouraging people from wanting to remain there, discouraging new tenants from trying to come in. And crucially, often these households were very hard to reach by social services. So even though there were really valuable family centres and community development centres on the estates, the marginalised minorities were not the people who showed up to bring their kids to the family centre, etc. So that was a key challenge. How do we reach these groups? So finally, just to wrap up, as I mentioned, one of our objectives was to look at the implications for policy of our research. So I'll just go through these briefly. The first implication for policy, the first finding we had was that the quality of buildings are rarely the sole problem in estates where livability is declining. But often in Ireland, refurbishment of buildings is the sole solution neighbourhoods are offered. So just to illustrate this with an example from the 7 estates, both of these photographs are of the Dean Rock estate in Cork. And of all the estates we studied, we found that Dean Rock was consistently the most livable, settled area and was in very, very high demand among applicants for housing. But this is despite the fact that the build quality of Dean Rock was extremely poor. So the photograph on the left is a picture taken from, I think it's an annual report to the National Building Agency. It's of Dean Rock just after it was built, system built. And you can see the little things sticking out the front are actually the coal sheds. So you put your coal in the front and then kind of stepped over it to get into the front door. So the build quality was really bad. The picture at the bottom is a more recent picture we took in 1998, I think, of the flats in Dean Rock that were particularly poor physical quality. But yet there was a waiting list of 4 years to get a flat in Dean Rock because the cohesiveness of the community was very, very strong. It was located in a good mixed income neighbourhood, very good schools, etc. So I just illustrate this here in the slide with a quote from our field notes taken in the late 90s. Where we interviewed a woman who lived in the flats and said that she was very comfortable in her home and she had a dogged resolve to remain there as long as she could. All her family lived there. She had no desire to move, even though she was aware of the structural problems and the flats didn't look well. So poor built environment can certainly undermine people's quality of life, and that should be addressed if it's an issue, but it shouldn't be the sole intervention in these neighbourhoods. Our other finding was that disadvantage does matter. If people are poor, it undermines their quality of life, it undermines their life chances, It also undermines the reputation of the social housing sector. But one problem in Ireland is that where we have government funding to spend on disadvantaged neighbourhoods, when it's targeted, or sometimes it isn't that well targeted, but where it is targeted, it's generally targeted solely on the basis of disadvantage. And two neighbourhoods can be equally disadvantaged, but one can be very livable, settled, successful community, and one can have severe problems of livability. So the livability of neighbourhoods should also be taken into account in targeting spending. We found that community development programmes have very significant benefits in terms of promoting community cohesiveness, but as well as interventions targeted at the whole community, it's very important that there are interventions by social housing managers and by government target the disaffected, hard-to-reach minorities that we identified in some of these states. So some of the policy interventions we recommend in the book are more spending on estate management by social housing landlords. We found that this was one of the most positive things that happened in the 7 estates during the 10 years we looked at them. There were local social housing managers appointed who looked after antisocial behaviour, ensured that the estate was well managed, etc. That was a really positive development. It's also important to have more effective policing, efforts to combat antisocial behaviour, targeted drug treatment programmes where it's necessary, but also family support programmes, support for young offenders or young people at risk of offending, and education support programmes which target the hard-to-reach families. So rather than just targeting spending on educational disadvantage in schools, we need to target the young people who don't make it to school in the first place.